I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project. Shroud of Turin research project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin.
Barry Schwartz never imagined that a trip to Italy would become the defining moment of his entire life. He was a skeptic in the truest sense of the word, not casually doubtful, but professionally trained to distrust anything that could not be measured, tested, and proven on paper. In 1978, when he was invited to join STURP, the Shroud of Turin research project, he laughed about it with his colleagues on the plane ride over. He told them this was essentially a free vacation. He would walk in, find the medieval brushstrokes within a few hours, write his report, and be back home before the week was over. He had worked with NASA. He had photographed things most human beings never get within 1,000 miles of. He was not the kind of man who got surprised. But Turin had something waiting for him that no amount of professional experience had prepared him for. The team arrived with enough scientific equipment to fill an entire laboratory. Spectrometers, UV light systems, microscopes, cameras capable of capturing detail invisible to the human eye. They had clearance to do what no team before them had ever been allowed to do, a direct, hands-on scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin. The cloth had been kept under lock for centuries. Popes had guarded it. Wars had been fought near it. And now a group of scientists, most of them skeptics, were finally going to settle the question once and for all. The room where the shroud was kept had a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of an empty space, but the silence that arrives when the human brain encounters something it has no existing category for. The cloth was roughly 14 feet long and 3 feet wide. A linen fabric, ancient and faintly yellowed, carrying the dim image of a man who had clearly undergone tremendous physical suffering. Schwartz set up his cameras and began shooting. Not hundreds of photographs, thousands. He had brought special lights and filters specifically designed to detect the smallest trace of pigment or dye hidden within any fiber. He was looking for brushstrokes. He was looking for the human hand behind the fraud. Hours passed. Then more hours. The brushstrokes were not there. That alone would have been strange. But the closer he looked, the more confusing it became. The image existed only on the very outermost surface of the fibers, a fraction of a millimeter deep. So thin that if you took a razor blade and scraped the top layer of a single fiber, the image simply disappeared, leaving clean white linen underneath. Nothing had ever soaked into the cloth. No paint, no dye, no ink, no liquid of any kind. The image sat on top of the fabric the way a photograph sits on photographic paper. Except photography would not be invented for another 18 centuries after this cloth was supposedly made. Several researchers paused their work and stood still. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then came the VP8 moment, and that was when something in the room permanently shifted. The VP8 image analyzer was a NASA instrument used to generate three-dimensional maps of planetary surfaces. When the team fed a standard photograph into the machine, the result was a distorted, unusable mess. That was expected. Normal photographs do not contain three-dimensional spatial data. But when they fed an image of the shroud into the VP8, what appeared on the monitor stopped everyone in the room cold. A perfect, mathematically consistent three-dimensional human form rose from the screen. The angles were correct. The proportions were anatomically accurate. Every curve of the body responded precisely as it would if a real physical form had been wrapped inside that cloth and the cloth had somehow recorded the exact distance between itself and every point of the body beneath it. Some researchers stopped taking notes. They simply stared at the monitor. This was something no forger could have anticipated, because no forger in the medieval period had any concept of three-dimensional encoded data. No artist painting a cloth would ever think to encode spatial information into brushwork, even if they somehow knew how. The VP8 machine itself did not exist until the 20th century. And yet the information was there, waiting inside the cloth for the right technology to come along and read it. On top of this, the image was a photographic negative, meaning when you look at the shroud with your naked eye, the tones are reversed, like a camera negative. But when the image is processed correctly, a fully detailed face and body appear with startling clarity. No one in medieval Europe had any concept of photographic negatives either. Photography would not exist for another 500 years. And yet both of these things, the negative image and the 3D spatial encoding, were sitting inside this piece of linen, perfectly preserved. Schwartz went back to his room that night and looked at his own photographs for hours. Alone. Quiet. And for the first time in his professional life, he genuinely did not know what to think. The team worked for 120 hours straight. Every square inch of the cloth was tested. They checked for heat, no scorch marks anywhere. They checked for chemical vapors, because one theory suggested that gases rising from a decomposing body might have created the image. But gases would have produced a blurred, diffused result. This image was sharp. The face was so detailed that individual features were clearly distinguishable. They examined the cellulose, the chemical compound that makes up linen fibers, and found that in the areas where the image existed, the cellulose had been dehydrated, chemically altered, as though an intense burst of energy had passed through the cloth for a fraction of a second, changed the molecular structure of the fibers at the image locations, and then vanished, leaving no burn, no char, no collateral damage to the surrounding threads. That energy source does not exist today. That tool has never been built. In the decades since 1978, researchers have attempted to replicate the image formation using lasers, UV radiation, particle beams, and every other mechanism they could conceive. Every single attempt has failed. The results are always either too deep, too uneven, or microscopically wrong in ways that become obvious under magnification. Peer-reviewed scientific literature has stated this consistently. The image formation mechanism is unknown. There is no debate about this within serious research circles. There is simply a wall, and beyond that wall, science has not yet been able to go. The blood was a separate problem entirely. When Schwartz first looked at the stains, they were bright red. Vivid, almost fresh-looking red. And that was immediately suspicious to him, because ancient blood does not stay red. It oxidizes. It turns brown, then black. He was certain this was the most obvious tell. Someone had used red paint to simulate wounds. This was going to be the easiest part of the debunking. But then a biochemist named Alan Adler made contact with the team, and everything Schwartz thought he understood about the blood turned upside down. Adler had spent his career studying blood chemistry at a level most people never encounter. He explained that the red color was not evidence of paint. It was evidence of something far more specific. When a human being undergoes extreme physical trauma sustained over many hours, the liver begins to break down. This releases a compound called bilirubin directly into the bloodstream. Bilirubin functions as a natural red pigment. It binds to hemoglobin and permanently alters the color of the blood, so that even centuries later, blood from a person who died in this kind of prolonged, tortured state would remain red. Not brown. Not black. The laboratory confirmed it. No paint. No artificial dye. Real human hemoglobin. Real human albumin. Elevated bilirubin levels consistent with hours of severe physical trauma. And then the detail that made the entire picture darker and stranger. The blood was on the cloth before the image was created. The bloodstains came first. Whatever process generated the image formed around the blood, not over it. Which meant a man had been wrapped in this linen. His blood had soaked into the fibers. And then something happened. The forensic evidence on the cloth told a story in precise, clinical detail. More than 100 whip marks were present, consistent with a Roman instrument called a flagrum, a multi-tipped whip with small metal or bone pieces attached to each end, designed to tear skin. The wounds on the wrists, not the palms, showed where spikes had been driven through, a detail that matters because the palm cannot support the weight of a hanging body. The bones would fracture and the nails would pull through. Ancient Roman crucifixion records confirm the wrists were the actual point of attachment. A large wound on the right side matched the dimensions of a Roman lancea. Soil particles found near the foot region matched the geological composition of the Jerusalem area. Pollen found throughout the cloth followed a geographical trail consistent with a journey from the Middle East through Anatolia and into Europe. This was not a painting. This was a forensic crime scene. When modern DNA sequencing technology became available, Scientists believed they would finally get a clean, definitive answer. Trace the contamination. Find medieval European DNA. Close the case. The results did not cooperate. Deep within the fibers, not just on the surface where handlers might have left traces, DNA was found indicating ancestry from South Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. Researchers initially categorized this as contamination from centuries of handling. But the blood stains themselves told a different story. The genetic profile extracted from the blood followed a pattern that was rare in ways that were difficult to explain. 3 separate laboratories verified the results independently because each one believed their equipment had malfunctioned. Some geneticists acknowledged privately that certain sequences were structurally unusual, incomplete in a way they had not encountered before. Some genetic markers were so archaic that they appeared to reference a population that has not existed for thousands of years. And the most direct problem: if this cloth was created as a forgery in medieval Europe, the DNA should predominantly reflect medieval Europeans. It does not. It does not reflect that at all. The scientific community did not reach a consensus. What happened instead was a fracture. Researchers divided between those who wanted to keep investigating and those who preferred to move on without resolution. And through all of it, the Vatican remained largely silent. That silence has its own weight. An institution that has survived 2,000 years of theological warfare, political upheaval, and scientific challenge, choosing not to say much about an object sitting in one of its own cathedrals, is itself a kind of statement. The carbon dating question sits uncomfortably in the middle of all of this. In 1988, 3 independent laboratories performed carbon-14 testing on samples from the Shroud and returned a date range of 1260 to 1390 AD, squarely within the medieval period. For many people, that was the end of the story. But subsequent analysis identified a significant problem with the methodology. The sample used for dating was taken from a corner of the cloth that historical records and microscopic examination both suggest was repaired at some point, new threads rewoven into the original fabric to fix damage. The carbon dating may have measured a mixture of original ancient linen and medieval repair material, producing a date that reflected neither accurately. This is not a fringe claim. Textile experts and material scientists have examined the fiber composition of that corner and found evidence consistent with reweaving. The debate about the carbon dating has not closed. It has simply moved to a more technical level where most people are not following it. It is worth saying clearly, science does not confirm this is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. What science confirms is considerably more limited and considerably more strange. It confirms an image that cannot be explained by any known process. It confirms blood from a real human being who died under conditions of extreme and prolonged trauma. It confirms a DNA profile that does not match what a medieval forgery should produce. And it confirms that after decades of examination by some of the most credentialed researchers in their respective fields, the fundamental questions remain open. Barry Schwartz spent the rest of his life maintaining a scientific archive of all the research data, making it freely available to anyone who wanted to examine it. He gave interviews. He answered questions. He never profited from any of it. He said repeatedly that he had gone to Italy as a Jewish man with zero interest in validating a Christian relic, and that the data had simply refused to accommodate his expectations. He was a technical man who had always believed that the universe operated according to rules that could eventually be mapped and understood. The Shroud had not disproven that belief exactly. It had simply shown him that the map was not yet complete. The cloth is still in Turin. New technologies are still being aimed at it. And something consistent keeps happening. The more sophisticated the instrument pointed at this fabric, the more anomalous the results become. Not less. Not more explainable with time. As though the object was constructed with a kind of patience, built to withstand scrutiny, designed to outlast every framework used to examine it, waiting for a question that has not yet been asked. The image remains on the surface of fibers thinner than a human hair. The blood remains chemically preserved in ways that defy standard decomposition. The three-dimensional data remains encoded in linen, readable only by technology invented 2,000 years after the cloth was made. It sits there, silent. And the silence is the part that science, for all its precision and all its power, still does not know how to answer.